She is running for president of the United States, and you guys have been sending me tons of questions that you guys want to hear from her. So I put together a list of some that we might have time for today, and we're just going to get started. And Joe, one of the biggest questions I get asked all the time is, how does a libertarian president work with Congress to get libertarian policies passed? And what sort of policies do you think that you can find common ground on?
Well, not by working with them the way that Ronald Reagan did. A lot of people say, oh, let's return to the small government days of Ronald Reagan, but they don't realize that he actually made government bigger every single year, year after year for 8 years. And people closest to him said, well, you know, Congress never gave him a balanced budget, or Congress never gave him a smaller budget. But not once did he send the budget back and say, no, I'm not signing it. Sharpen your pencil, come back again. So not that they couldn't override me, but I would keep sending it back and make them work. Also, I would remind them who was elected president, and if they'd like their cushy jobs of a lot of pay, then maybe they should follow what the constituents want, which is a libertarian policy.
Okay. One of the policies that you have advocated is giving an opt-in or an opt-out solution for Social Security and replacing it with the CATO's, or something similar to the Cato 6.2 plan, which the Social Security Administration themselves even evaluated and stated would return the program to solvency. One big question a lot of people give me, and when they hear replacing Social Security, replacing welfare, they worry that we're kind of radicals that are going to yank the carpet out from under them, and people on disability are going to lose their benefits. What can you say, like, what does the process look like to people that are on disability or dependent on these government programs when a libertarian becomes president?
Well, I would say that this is probably the biggest reason why I was actually nominated from the Libertarian Party, is because the other people running were kind of advocating perhaps yanking out the rug. That under my proposal, what we're going to do is we're going to sell government assets, which is what their money went towards anyway, and return their money to them. So, you know, we heard about Al Gore with his lockbox, right? The money's in a lockbox. We all know that's not true. So where did the money go? Well, it went to downtown office buildings and other assets. So how about we sell those assets, return the money to the rightful owner? Okay,
good. Another big question that comes up is, how do we reduce the cost of healthcare across the board while still maintaining standards of care? Because people seem to fear, if the government's not involved in healthcare, how do we know we'll get good healthcare? It's kind of a confusing statement, but how do we assure people are going to get the best care that they can?
Well, those are actually two questions. You know, the second question was, how do we know we're going to get good health care without the government? I mean, how do we know we get good computers without the government? How do we know, how do we know we get good cars? I mean, I would suggest that the reason we have such good technology, the reason we have iPhones and good computers, is because the government stayed out of it. I've heard a lot of people say that basically the government couldn't keep up with the technology to tax it or try to regulate it. And so it moved so quickly that we were able to get good technology, and we would see the same thing with healthcare. Now, again, with healthcare, we can't yank the rug out from underneath people, especially since prices are artificially high because of the government. So if we were to end the government type system we have now, people couldn't afford the prices, the inflated prices that they are. So what I would do is I would do a system similar to what the state of Indiana does for its employees, which is also similar to what Singapore does, actually put healthcare dollars into accounts of the people, to where, and I would start with the VA hospital system, which, that's the worst care, and move to Medicare and Medicaid, in which I'm actually putting dollars into their hands. And then instead of having certain providers offer them certain health care, they would have the dollars to shop around. And if they're shopping around with their dollars and they get to keep the savings, we're going to see people competing for those dollars and see the prices go down. And that's what we have in Singapore. In Singapore, it costs about a third of what our costs are. So, for instance, heart bypass surgery costs something like $130,000 in our country, and it costs something like $18,000 in Singapore. So we need to get the prices down before we just let the market loose.
Okay. So I think that kind of leads me into another question, and it's a little bit of a multi-part question. During your acceptance speech, you gave the story of Libba Bray and some of the challenges she faced growing up and being involved in the LGBT community. And a question I get asked often from the LGBT community is, how do we as libertarians protect their rights? And as a follow-up, since we were just talking about medical care, they tend to bring people in that community that ask me questions, tend to ask how in a private healthcare system, if in theory people can refuse for medical reasons or religious reasons, how do people in a marginalized community that are maybe not cisgender or gender conforming be able to get their standards of care if there's possibility of discrimination? Or how do we protect them in general?
Yeah, well, again, we've got a government-run healthcare system, basically. If we look at the doctors, the number of doctors, the number of nurses, the number of hospitals, clinics, it's all regulated by the government. We don't have a free market system. We've got something called certificate of need, in which you can't even build a clinic or a hospital or even buy an MRI machine without getting approval from the government or somebody to show that there's a need. How about we just open it up and let people build their own clinics? And you know what? If a clinic isn't needed there, let it go bankrupt just like every other business. But now it is so protected that they can get away with everything. And to answer your first general question, how can libertarians protect the rights of LGBTQ? It's not the libertarians who would protect the rights, it's the free market. And my favorite story regarding this is the Walt Disney Company back in the early 90s started offering benefits to partners of their gay employees. So did the government make them? No, they did it because they wanted the best employees. They had to compete with other companies to get them. And just like serving people, you want customers, you want profits, and so you have to offer the best service again. And yet, fast forward, 20 years, 2012, we've got Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama still saying that gay marriage should be illegal. So here's a clear case in which the free market did a much better job of protecting those rights. And we've seen it throughout history that it's only through government protection that the people get away from serving the market. And two other quick cases, if you don't mind. Well, maybe not so quick, but I think...
No, you go ahead.
Is Milton Friedman said, okay, let's say that you bake bread and you need to buy flour. Are you going to buy flour from a white person who has expensive flour or a black person who has cheaper flour? You're going to buy it from the black person who has cheaper flour. Now, could you be racist and buy it from the white person? Absolutely. But you're more likely to go out of business. You're not going to make as much of a profit. And the market's going to say, no, that's not what we want. And so what we have right now is people who are propped up. A lot of people don't realize that after the slaves were freed, they were doing great for about 10 years because they were excellent craftsmen. They were hard workers. They were the ones who were doing all the work. And they went out, offered their services at a lower rate, which, by the way, is what I did when I started my company. And that's what most people do. You're new to the business, you offer a better price, and then people flock to you. So that's what they were doing, and people were flocking to them. And so then whites were like, well, okay, now what do we do? How do we compete? Well, instead of lowering their prices, they simply passed laws, and that was the beginning of Jim Crow, in which they were not able to sell their services anymore, or at least, basically we had discrimination built right into the system. And the last quick thing is, we all heard the story of Rosa Parks, heroic black woman who refused to sit on the back of the bus. Well, what people don't know is the rest of the story, which is that was a government-run, government-owned bus that was discriminating. And about 60% of the ridership at the time were blacks. Now imagine if today Uber did that. What if they discriminated against the best 60% of their customers? They would go bankrupt as well they should. It's only the government that can get away with it because they can't go bankrupt for basically violating our rights.
Okay, that's a great answer. We're going to shift gears here a little bit. Another question that comes up is affordable housing. In general, people in the younger generations view owning a house as something fairly unrealistic, let alone paying their rent. What can you do as president to help lower the cost of housing throughout the country to make it at least more affordable? Maybe not lower necessarily, but more affordable and accessible to people.
Well, again, the market is intertwined. We've got housing costs, we've got healthcare costs, we've got education costs, we've got all these costs, and then with the amount of money that we're making. And I would suggest, instead of saying, well, how do we lower tuition or how do we lower housing costs, how about we open up the free market and get back to where people are competing and offering jobs at higher prices. But right now, again, we've got building codes, we've got zoning laws. In fact, it was estimated before that probably most of the homelessness is caused by zoning laws, that you've got, the way the laws are set up, it's basically rich people getting affordable housing at a cheap price. So what they do is they artificially hold prices down, and then only the rich people are able to afford them. So we've got everything topsy-turvy.
Okay. You mentioned tuition, which tuition costs in general over the last 30 years have skyrocketed across the country. People used to be able to work a part-time job and pay for college. But with government subsidies and student loans, I think that's led to a lot of tuition costs rising. What sort of policies would you put in to try and get the government out of higher education to reduce the cost, as well as including the free market, as you've just stated?
Well, let's start by getting rid of the Department of Education, for one, and see where we go from there. Tuition was affordable until the federal government got involved with handing out loans. In fact, I'm not sure if you saw was it Maxine Waters? It was kind of a funny clip where one of the Democrats was demanding of the bankers, what are you going to do about tuition? What are you going to do about these high student loans? And right down the line, the bankers looked at each other saying, we don't give student loans anymore. Who wants to do that? So back before the government got involved, it was affordable. But now that the government is involved, of course, what happened was, typical, it just supply economics. All of a sudden, there's a lot of money flooding the market. And so what do the colleges do? Oh, well, look at all this money. We can raise rates. And since you've got young people who aren't, who haven't really experienced what it's like to understand, accumulating interest rates, having interest rates on top of interest rates, they didn't quite understand really what that was like. So we've got, it's funny how we've got consumer laws protecting people, supposedly protecting people, and yet we've got the government who are just trapping college students into this tuition thing.
Mm-hmm. I fully understand that myself, but as do many people out here. Following up on that, a common objection I get when discussing abolishing the Department of Education would be, what would stop a teacher from teaching bad things or inappropriate things or treating students unfairly if we didn't have a Department of Education? People seem to think that that's what protects students. Can you explain how we can return educational choice to parents and teachers?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by bad things, but let me ask you this. Before the Department of Education was, put together in the 1970s, were bad things being taught? I'm just not quite sure.
I guess the types of things would be, what if you have a teacher who doesn't believe in evolution and wants to teach creationism in a class? Or I guess those types of things. Or if you had a bigoted teacher who wanted to be prejudiced against their students, my argument would be the same things that stops them now, the school districts. But how does removing I guess the real question is, explain to people how removing the Department of Education improves their school choice locally for them.
Well, and I would suggest that once again, just like the free market protected the LGBTQ community so much more than the federal government did, or state governments, since it was the state governments who wouldn't allow marriage. I would suggest the same thing would be for education. We've got the Department of Education at the federal level given a one-size-fits-all law for all of us. And if you look, the needs of, let's say, rural Appalachia, completely different from the needs of downtown New York City, different from California. So how about let's let each locality determine its own education? And it's funny because I actually use education as a reason, as a demonstration of what's wrong with government today and how it could be so much better. People ask me, why is our country so divisive? Why are we at polar opposites? And I would suggest it's because everything goes through government and you got to fight at the ballot box for everything. So let's say that you want to send your kid to a school that has prayer. Let's say your neighbor doesn't. Well, you've both got to go out, back your candidate, send in money, put out yard signs, convince people to vote on your side, go to the ballot box, and one of you is going to win, one of you is going to lose. And you both end up with the same system. But wouldn't it be so much better if instead of sending your money to Washington and then having it parsed back to you, to where you get to keep your money and then you decide what kind of education you want your child to have? And if you want to send your child to a school with prayer, fine. And then your neighbor can send his kid to a school that doesn't have prayer. Why can't we have choice in education the way we have it in everything else? The way we have it in buying a car or buying groceries. We've got some people who eat vegan, some people who eat meat. Let everybody make their own choices. And if you look at the Department of Education, they take, if you look at the budget, per pupil, it's something like $1,500 a year. And think of that money that if each student could keep, could go towards the kind of education that the parents wanted and not the kind of education that the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. want.
Okay, that's great. Next are some some kind of short style questions I think we could go through here, but one that gets asked, and I know you've addressed it before, but what steps would you take to defend the Second Amendment in America?
I would treat it as a constitutional right. We all saw how George Wallace stood on the steps of Governor Wallace in Alabama, stood on the steps keeping blacks from entering the school, and the federal government got involved because this was a constitutional right. I suggest that guns are a constitutional right, and it is the Second Amendment, and that what we need to do as the federal government is wherever a state or locality is not allowing people their constitutional rights, step in, just the way they stepped in and got Wallace out of the way of allowing blacks to enter the school. The Second Amendment's very clear. And even if it weren't clear, that's definitely something that is in the spirit of the government. And last, I would like to say that I am a gun owner. However, that's not why I feel so strongly about it. I feel strongly about individual rights, all individual rights. Okay,
good. Next one that comes up is, what is your favorite whiskey? I know you drink bourbon, so.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. Actually, I have a hard time getting it. Well, first of all, let me say I've been getting, I've visited a distillery a few days ago, and they were kind enough to give me a bottle, and it was great. The kind that I've traditionally bought over the last several years is a brand that nobody's ever heard of. It's called Backbone, and you can only buy it in Indiana, but it's uncut bourbon. That's pretty strong.
I'm going to have to look it up.
Yeah, it's pretty strong, where they write the batch number and the proof, and it's usually somewhere around like 115 proof. And, my friends and family say it tastes like something that you'd clean your car battery with. But any bourbon is good. I haven't run across a bad bourbon yet.
Yep. Good. Another one that comes up, and it's not necessarily a federal level thing, but it's something people want to know your opinion on, is, are you familiar with breed-specific laws or laws against bully breeds, and where do you stand on those types of legislation?
Well, can you explain that to me?
Okay, so in certain jurisdictions, they may ban certain breeds of dogs, like a pit bull or a Rottweiler in a community, and it can happen to people, and they either have to make a choice of moving or getting rid of their family member dog. And it's something that I don't know if you necessarily have a whole lot, but it's definitely something that removes choice from people.
Yeah. Well, and I am an animal lover, and I do have a dog, a basset hound named Gertrude. And I think probably I would move if I had to to keep her. But let me just say that part of the problems that we've gotten into, as I've mentioned, with education, healthcare, retirement, it's all been because of laws at the federal level. And this is probably something that the federal government should stay out of. And we've seen, for instance, people leave California in droves, and we're seeing people leave New York City in droves. I hate to say, I wish that the president could fix every problem, but he or she can't. And so sometimes we need to leave it up to the jurisdictions. However, I would suggest that people would come out ahead if the federal government just stayed out of their lives. Just as right now what we're seeing is all of the strife in with the police. And I would suggest that a lot of that is because the federal government got involved. The federal government's been handing out free tanks and tear gas and free training and then extra money to buy extra things. And so, whereas crime is something that's a local issue, if you look at assault, robbery, burglary, and it's something that the local police and the mayor, city council, voters, they should decide on. What's happened is the federal government has come along and basically militarized the police. So no longer are they, the protect and serve like they've got on the cop car. Instead, now it's an us versus them mentality. And I would suggest that if local communities had on the ballot, okay, do you want an increase in your property taxes so that we can buy a tank for our police department? Most people would say, heck no, I'd rather keep the extra money and, go on a nice vacation or go out to dinner a few times. But what we have instead is the federal government taking people's money and then dangling it back and saying, well, here you go, you want a free tank. So I would suggest that the federal government's job is, first of all, the function of government should be police, courts, and military, period. The federal government, it should not be police. It should be the courts, some of the courts and military. And then by the federal government staying out of each and every little problem, that people's lives overall would be improved.
Okay. And then I got basically just two more. I know you've got another interview coming up afterwards, I think. So one thing you have mentioned, being able to trade with countries like China and Japan is incentive for us not to go to war with these countries, that free trade is a good thing. And I know you've told a story about having a car when you were growing up, and someone had mentioned, like, why would you buy an Italian car or something? Which brings up a question quite often. Would you support removing the automobile import ban on vehicles that are, right now, you have to have cars that are manufactured outside the U.S. can't be brought in unless they're 25 years old. Would you remove that ban and allow these warehouses of cars to be able to be sold in America?
I would remove all bans that allow, I hate to say peaceful objects, but, I can't imagine having a ban on anything. Perhaps there's something, but cars, we drive cars. If it's something that we're allowed to own and buy and sell in our country, I'm not sure why we would want a ban, because that's how we get the lowest prices. And we get back to the question about how do we lower education costs, or how do we lower housing costs? How about we lower all costs by opening up our borders to where we can buy cheaper clothing, cheaper cars, and so forth, and have more money to spend on our housing or whatever it is. But what we have right now is the government picking winners and losers and coming up with ways for you to spend more money.
Okay. And I think we're just about at the end of the time, so I just want to give you one more question. What message do you have for the viewers for what they need to do between now and November to get you elected?
Well, two things. I would love for you to come to my website at joe20.com. That's JO20.com. And what's really exciting, and you may have heard this, about 75% of our volunteers are from outside the party. And it's been that way since pretty much the first week. We've been overwhelmed with that, ecstatically overwhelmed that some people are saying, yeah, we don't have a choice and we want a choice. And also, if somebody calls you between now and November and asks who you're voting for, even if your mind isn't completely made up, but you think maybe you might vote for me, tell them that you'll vote for me so that I can get to 15% in the polls, so that I can get into the debates. Because if we just have who we have right now, we basically have #fake debates, fake debates, because it's a debate between two people who both want to take away your decision making, both want to make more decisions for you. Neither one wants to bring the troops home, and they both will do nothing to keep healthcare costs from being the crushing costs they are now. So, and the only reason they have it set up this way isn't to help Americans, it's to keep the Democrats and Republicans in power. So please let us get our voice heard.
All right. Well, Joe, I appreciate your time. I don't want to hold you any longer. Thank you and good luck on the road. And I wish you best of luck this November. And thank you for your time.
Well, thanks. Great being here. Have a